Today, we're diving into the story of a 7-year fight for justice. I mean, this is a case that began on a remote beach in Queensland, sparked a massive international manhunt, and led to one of the biggest rewards in the state's history, all to catch a killer. This is the case of Toyah Cordingley. You know, it's strange how the most terrible things can start so normally. Picture this. It's October 2018. A young woman is on a beautiful remote beach up in far north Queensland, just taking her dog for a walk. It's a scene you'd see any day of the week, right? But this particular walk? This one was going to end in a tragedy that would shake an entire community to its core. So, what happened next kicked off one of Queensland's biggest ever homicide investigations. And for years, the public was just completely captivated by it. It makes you wonder, right? Why this case? What was it about this story that resonated so deeply with an entire nation? And maybe more importantly, what did it finally take to bring a suspect to justice? To really get a grip on just how huge this investigation became, we have to go all the way back to that day. Let's start with the person at the very heart of this story, Toyah Cordingley. So, who was Toyah? Well, she was just 24 years old. And from everything her friends and family have said, she was this active, compassionate person who just loved being outdoors. She had this incredible connection with animals and was totally devoted to her dog, Indy. So on that afternoon, she drove out to Wangetti Beach. It's this quiet stretch of coast between Cairns and Port Douglas for a walk with Indy. But she didn't come home. As the hours ticked by, her family, they got that sinking feeling. They grew deeply concerned, and they called the police. And the search, it ended in just absolute heartbreak. The very next morning, it was Toyah's own father who found her. He discovered her body partially buried in the sand dunes only a few hundred meters from her car. Her dog, Indy, was found tied to a tree nearby, unharmed. Police knew right away what they were dealing with. They declared it a homicide and launched a massive investigation on the spot. Finding Toyah's body, that was really just the beginning of this whole ordeal. The investigation that came next, well, it would turn into a long, frustrating, and just incredibly challenging search for answers. What's so striking when you look at the timeline is just how long everything took. I mean, years went by. You had extensive forensic work, constant public appeals, but nothing. No arrests. The case just stayed open, leaving her family and the whole community in this awful state of limbo. But then, in 2022, something big happened. A major development finally breathed new life into the search. And that development, a $1 million reward, $1 million. Queensland police put it up, and it was one of the largest rewards in the entire history of the state for information leading to an arrest and conviction. I mean, talk about a clear signal. This showed just how determined the authorities were to finally crack this case. And you know what? This massive incentive, it worked. The reward brought the case roaring back into the headlines. It sparked new appeals, forced a fresh look at all the evidence, and, this is the crucial part, it helped lock in the international cooperation they desperately needed to chase a lead that stretched halfway around the world. Yeah, that international cooperation was absolutely key, because by this point, the investigation had gone global. Police were now zeroing in on one particular individual, someone who had left the country just days after Toyah was killed. Their focus landed on a man named Rajwinder Singh. He was a former nurse who actually lived not too far from the crime scene. And here's the critical piece of the puzzle. Just days after Toyah's murder, he got on a plane to India. He just left. Abruptly abandoned his job, his wife, his child, everything. Now, getting him back to Australia, that was a whole other battle. It was a monumental task. We're talking years of really complex, delicate coordination between Australian and Indian authorities. But they did it. Finally, in March of 2023, Singh was arrested in New Delhi. And after a whole lot of legal wrangling, he was extradited back to Australia to finally stand trial. But hold on, because even with the main suspect back in Queensland, this story was far from over. The path to a conviction was anything but straightforward. In fact, the legal battle would end up needing 2 separate trials. So, in early 2025, the first trial kicks off. The prosecution's case was built on what's called circumstantial evidence. Now, that doesn't mean it's weak, it just means there's no single smoking gun like an eyewitness. Instead, it's a collection of puzzle pieces, forensic findings, mobile phone data, Singh's own movements, that when you put them all together are meant to paint a clear picture of guilt. But it wasn't enough. After days of deliberation, the jury was deadlocked. They couldn't agree. That's what's known as a hung jury. And what it means, essentially, is that the trial is a wash. It's a do-over. The whole thing results in a mistrial, and the prosecution has to decide if they're going to try the whole case all over again with a new jury. You can only imagine, for Toyah's family, it must have been an absolutely devastating setback. But the fight still wasn't over. So later that same year, the prosecution went for it. They moved forward with a second trial. They laid out all their key evidence again, really hammering home the forensic analysis and Singh's bizarre behavior, especially that sudden flight out of Australia. The defense pushed back hard, but this time, the outcome was different. The jury came back with a verdict, guilty of murder. And just like that, after years and years of uncertainty, of waiting, of fighting, a verdict, it was finally delivered, bringing a formal close to what had been one of the most painful chapters in the region's history. The sentence? Life in prison. And during the sentencing, the judge didn't mince words. He described the killing as violent and opportunistic, and he made a point to acknowledge the profound, devastating impact it had, not just on Toyah's family, but on the entire community. That life sentence came with a non-parole period of 25 years. Just think about that. It means Singh has to serve at least a quarter of a century behind bars before he can even be considered for release. You know, the legacy of a case like this is just immense. It really forced a difficult and necessary conversation about public safety, particularly for women in more isolated places. People established memorials for Toyah, and her memory became this symbol of a community's grief, but also its resilience. And the investigation itself, with its sheer length and complexity, has absolutely cemented its place in the region's history. And all of this really leaves us with one final lingering thought. Toyah Cordingley just went for a walk on the beach, a simple, everyday act of freedom that so many of us take for granted. The loss of that freedom, in such a brutal way, it raised a question that I think Far North Queensland is still grappling with today. How does a single, senseless act change an entire community's sense of safety forever?